One of the common, still, criticisms of the book of Daniel is that it has to be dated in the 2nd century. Why? Because its depiction in chapter 11 particularly of the period, the Greek period after Alexander the Great's empire had been divided up among his generals, and particularly the north and the south, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, their wars and their tensions and what happened is so accurately described that many scholars say Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, after those events had happened. Why? Because he couldn't possibly have known in the 6th century BC what was going to happen in the 2nd century BC. Why? Because there's no such thing as predictive prophecy. Why? Because this universe is dominated by naturalism.
No, that's not a fair representation of the scholarship on Daniel at all. Hold on just a second. We saw in the last chapter that apocalypses are usually pseudonymous, that is, written in the name of some earlier figure. The fact that Ezra and Baruch were historical characters does not require us to believe that they were in any way responsible for the apocalypses composed in their names. Conversely, the existence of a long-standing tradition about a wise and righteous Daniel does not prove that the biblical book of Daniel is pseudonymous. So, how are we to judge authorship? There are many tests, but the simplest and surest is historical. Pseudonymous apocalyptic writings of this type are typically hazy about the distant past, increasingly accurate about the recent past, accurate about and attentive to the immediate past, and wholly speculative and often completely wrong about the future. Just as we would expect, pseudonymous authors knew a good deal more about their own time than they knew about earlier history, and they possessed no knowledge of events yet to come. Such works are dated to the moment at which they shift from increasingly accurate and detailed recollection of the past to largely inaccurate and stereotypical speculation about the future. This transition typically occurs at about the same point in the apocalyptic drama, at the end of history as usual and the beginning of the period of tribulation preceding God's ultimate victory. A book's date of composition is reckoned as the point beyond which it ceases to provide accurate information. When this location post-dates the life of its reputed author, the book is thought to be pseudonymous. For example, the final historical events accurately foretold in 4th Ezra all concern the Roman Empire in the 1st century. The book also refers to the destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. For these reasons, the book is thought to be a product of the late 1st century. Ezra himself lived hundreds of years earlier, shortly after the time of the Babylonian captivity. Therefore, 4th Ezra is judged to be pseudonymous. Note that the issue is not whether scholars believe in the possibility of predictive prophecy. Few interpreters of any religious persuasion today believe that Ezra wrote the Apocalypse of 4th Ezra. The issue is not the faith of the scholar, but the literary genre and historical location of the text. Does Daniel fit this pattern? Yes, absolutely. Although the story is set in Babylon at the time of the exile, there are numerous errors in its depiction of the historical events of that period, both in the narrative and the visionary sections of the book. For example, the dating of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem in 1 verse 1 is incorrect. It was Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, who was defeated and taken captive. Similarly, Belshazzar was neither the son of Nebuchadnezzar nor reigned as king, contra Daniel 5 verses 1 and 2. In general, the author's knowledge of Babylonian and Persian history is both thin and inexact. Once the historical visions take us past the conquests of Alexander in 11 verse 3, and the division of his enemies, 11 verse 4 and 2 verse 41, the information increases dramatically both in precision and abundance. The reign of Antiochus IV, a notorious persecutor of the Jews, takes up the whole of 11 verses 21 to 45. Verses 40 to 45 relate the story of the destruction of Antiochus and his forces. Unfortunately, both for the Jews and for the book of Daniel, although not perhaps for Antiochus himself, it did not happen. Most glaringly, Antiochus did not die in Palestine, as in 11 verse 45. Instead, his life ended in Persia a few years later, in 163 BC. True to apocalyptic form, Daniel sees the eschatological climax as the very next event on the prophetic calendar. For these and other reasons, scholars, the majority by a long shot, date the apocalyptic sections of Daniel to about the year 165 BC. That is, after 167 BC, when Antiochus erected an altar to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple, but before his death in 163 BC. This date is passionately challenged by conservative scholars who in principle oppose any claim that Holy Scripture might contain pseudonymous books. Their dedication and resourcefulness are admirable, and I sometimes wish they were right, but they are paddling against a tidal wave of evidence. It is special pleading to argue that Daniel should not be subjected to the same historical analysis that demonstrates that Ezra did not write 4th Ezra and Enoch did not write 1st Enoch. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, and beyond all reasonable doubt, this particular gander dates from the middle of the 2nd century before Christ.